In this tutorial, we learn how to deal with some slightly more intimidating scenarios. For instance, we'll be learning how to deal with a fraction on top of another fraction, or a whole number on top of a fraction, as well as a fraction on top of a whole number. And all the way through, there are two things that we'll need to remember. The first is that a fraction can always be rewritten as a division. The second is to remember that dividing by a number is the same thing as multiplying by its reciprocal. Now that that's said, let's go ahead and get started. Consider the example we see here. We have a fraction whose numerator is a fraction and whose denominator is a fraction. To calculate this, it's important to realize that when we say 2 over 3 over 5 over 7, we can think of this as 2 over 3 divided by 5 over 7. In other words, we could rewrite this as 2 over 3 divided by 5 over 7. And we're now dealing with a scenario that we know how to solve. Indeed, we have 2 over 3 which is being divided by 5 over 7. And the trick for calculating this is to remember that dividing by 5 over 7 is the same thing as multiplying by the reciprocal of 5 over 7, which is 7 over 5. So we can write that this equals to 2 over 3 times 7 over 5. We're now dealing with two fractions that are being multiplied. And to calculate this, all we have to do is multiply the two numerators together as well as the two denominators together. So this equals to 2 times 7 over 3 times 5. Finally, we can state that this equals to 2 times 7, which is 14, over 3 times 5, which is 15. And we're done. We've just calculated 2 over 3 over 5 over 7. And the trick was to realize that we could rewrite this large fraction as the top fraction being divided by the bottom one. Okay, now that we've seen how to deal with a fraction on top of another fraction, let's see how to deal with a whole number on top of a fraction. So consider the example we see here. We have 5 over 2 over 3. Well, the trick for calculating this is very similar to what we've just seen. The key thing to realize here is that we can rewrite 5 over 2 over 3 as 5 divided by 2 over 3. In other words, we can write that this equals to 5 divided by 2 over 3. And we're now dealing with a whole number which is being divided by a fraction. And as we now know, dividing by 2 over 3 is the same thing as multiplying by the reciprocal of 2 over 3. In other words, it's the same thing as multiplying by 3 over 2. So we can rewrite this as 5 times 3 over 2. We now have a whole number which is multiplying a fraction. To calculate this, all we have to do is multiply the numerator by that whole number. So we can write that this equals to 5 times 3 over 2. Finally, calculating the numerator, we find that this equals to 5 times 3, which is 15, over 2. And we're done. We've just calculated 5 over 2 over 3. Let's look at one last scenario in which we have a fraction on top of a whole number. Something looking like this. Here we have a fraction, 4 over 5, over a whole number, 3. And the trick for calculating this is to realize that when we say 4 over 5 over 3, it's the same thing as saying 4 over 5 divided by 3. In other words, we can rewrite this as 4 over 5 divided by 3. And we're now clearly faced with a fraction which is being divided by a whole number. And we know how to do this. Remember, division is the same thing as multiplication by the reciprocal. So when we say divided by 3, it's the same thing as multiplying by 1 over 3. That's the reciprocal of 3. So we can rewrite this as 4 over 5 times 1 over 3. We now have two fractions that are being multiplied. And to calculate this, all we have to do is multiply the two numerators together as well as the two denominators together, which leads us to 4 times 1 over 5 times 3. And calculating both the numerator and the denominator leads us to the final answer. That's 4 times 1, which is 4, over 5 times 3, which is 15. And we're done. We've just calculated 4 over 5 over 3. And there we have it. We now know how to deal with fractions on top of fractions, or whole numbers on top of fractions, and even fractions on top of whole numbers. The trick is to not be intimidated by what we see, and to realize that we can always rewrite the fraction as a division. And that's it for this tutorial.